So welcome back, University of Miami students, to the second edition of the long-awaited case study into the granddaddy of all of the big cases when it comes to the topic of conspiracy theories in the public. It is, of course, the JFK assassination. You have had an opportunity to listen to Jefferson Morley and Rolf Larson, two distinguished scholars who bring the perspective that says, yes, there was a conspiracy in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, that felled the 35th president of the United States. But now we're actually going to turn the tables and bring two historians and scholars that argue the opposite, that in fact, what we learned in the 48 hours and 72 hours and the immediate aftermath of the assassination story is really what happened, that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting unaided and alone from the Texas School Depository, fired the 3 shots from the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that successfully assassinated President Kennedy and injured Governor John Connally, and subsequently was shot and killed by another lone assassin acting alone in Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner. So we welcome to the University of Miami, Steve Gillon and Gerald Posner. And let me give you a little bit of background first on these two gentlemen, because we could have gotten anybody to talk about this, but I feel honored that we have perhaps two of the most reputable, serious, and credible thinkers on the subject of the Kennedy assassination from the Warren Commission perspective, kicking it off with Steve Gillon, who is the resident historian of the History Channel. He's also a professor of modern U.S. history at the University of Oklahoma, is a PhD from Brown University, and has written numerous books and articles on modern American politics and culture. Two of my favorites are the book Pearl Harbor, How FDR Led the Nation to War. That was written in 2011. Also, the Kennedy assassination 24 hours after Lyndon Johnson's pivotal first day as president, and his most recent work, America's Reluctant Prince, The Life of John F. Kennedy Jr. And joining Steve is Gerald Posner, one of America's greatest investigative journalists and author of 13 books, including what is, without question, the seminal study on the Kennedy assassination, If You Indeed Believe That Lee Harvey Oswald Acted Alone. The book is called Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. The Chicago Tribune called Gerald Posner a merciless pit bull of an investigator. And if you don't believe me, read his latest book, Pharma, which takes a look at the pharmaceutical industries and the greed, lies, and poisoning of America. That's actually out and available in bookstores around the world. Steve Gillon and Gerald Posner, welcome to the University of Miami.
Nice to be with you.
So, Steve, I thought it would be a great opportunity for you to kind of kick it off, speaking from your perspective as a historian and thinking about the idea of conspiracy theories. Why not just around the Kennedy assassination, but why in a lot of sense they've really captured the imagination of how Americans have engaged in this sort of thinking over the last 60 years?
So there have been conspiracy theories about many events in American history. I go back to Pearl Harbor, the Kennedy assassination, and more recently 9/11. The question is, why do we turn to these conspiracy theories? And I think, especially with the Kennedy assassination and also with Pearl Harbor, we simply have a difficult time accepting that a loser like Lee Harvey Oswald could assassinate a man as great as John F. Kennedy. And in Kennedy's case in particular, it's Kennedy dies at a key moment. In November of 1963, he dies before we have urban rioting, before the escalation of the war in Vietnam, before the rise of the counterculture, and then you have Watergate. And there's a sense that the years that Kennedy was in power and before were days when America stood strong in the world, where gender roles and other roles were sort of fairly well established. So we needed to find some meaning in Kennedy's death. And the meaning that we found in his death was to find some larger explanation beyond the fact that a single man with a rifle in the 6th floor window school depository building could shoot JFK. So we have imbued his death with meaning. And many of the people who believe in conspiracy theories believe that had Kennedy lived, things would have turned out differently, that Kennedy's death marked a pivotal moment in our history. So there has to be some explanation for what that happened, and some explanation that gives Kennedy's life larger meaning. And I think the problem with that, it's all well intended, but the problem is Kennedy was a complicated figure. We don't know whether Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam or not. There's very little evidence that Kennedy would have been able to quell the social unrest that took place in the United States. But conspiracy theories, whether it's the Cubans or the Russians, or with the theory that has gained prominence over the past years, the American government itself assassinated Kennedy, they all have, and whether it's Oliver Stone, which sort of created the mother of all conspiracy theories, the idea is that Kennedy's death had a meaning beyond the events that actually took place in Dealey Plaza.
Gerald, we go from that to the particulars of the case. And you, of course, did not start out as a JFK assassination investigator. It was something that you came to. But in kind of doing your own assessment, what led you to believe, in looking at the evidence and after the exhaustive years you spent studying the case, led you to the position that the case is closed and that the government and the Warren Commission got it right, that it was Oswald acting alone?
Well, you know, Fernand, the last thing I ever expected would be to come to that conclusion. I went to Berkeley for undergraduate in the early 70s. We were protesting in Sproul Plaza against the Vietnam War and what was going on in Cambodia and Laos and being gassed by the Alameda State Police. If you had asked me then, or you told me that Oswald alone had killed Kennedy, I would have thought you were a government agent or you were absolutely insane and should be put back into an institution. I was at law school when the House Select Committee was going through its re-examination. It came to a conclusion, 95% probability of a conspiracy. So I thought it was the mob, most likely because Jack Ruby, with connections to the mafia, a nightclub owner, kills Oswald 2 days later. It looks like every mafia movie I've ever seen in which somebody gets silenced for doing something. When I went off to investigate it, you introduced me before very kindly, too kindly, as a great investigative journalist. You don't think an investigative journalist is going to come back and say, by the way, the Warren Commission made some errors, but they basically got it right. The greatest story to come back with is the absolute, smoking gun, bad word to use in the Kennedy assassination, but the piece of evidence which Steve Gillon, Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, everybody who's a historian and news person of some credibility would look at and say, you know what, that's unmistakably right. It is a conspiracy. I just didn't find it here. And so in the end, I've always said that all the credible evidence, both what happens in the Zapruder film, and you see the shots, and people can look at that and they debate it different ways. I'm convinced that the latest technology shows that whoever the shooter was, that shooter was placed behind the president. The only person who hit anybody that day in Dealey Plaza was shooting behind the president. You then need to ask, who were they? Were they a world-class assassin, or was it Oswald? And if it was Oswald, was he doing it for himself or as part of a conspiracy? Those are all difficult steps as you go along the way. But in the end, I'm convinced that today, all the credible evidence points to Oswald alone. I'm open to something else, but I haven't seen it as of 2020. We're talking about this. It's still not there. There's a lot of conjecture, a lot of speculation, but there's nothing when you get to the substance of it to convince me otherwise.
Steve, you talked about the conspiratorial mindset and the seemingly unwillingness of not just many Americans, but millions around the world to accept the premise that someone like Oswald could take out a figure as gallant and as powerful as John F. Kennedy. Yet, is there enough in even the evidence, from your perspective, to suggest that engaging in thinking that challenges the official version of events is worthwhile, that there might be enough incongruencies or elements there that just don't add up or make sense, beginning with something as base as Oswald's own motivation? If he was acting alone and he did this crime to gain the infamy that he was seeking and the notoriety that someone of such low station in life had, why then did he deny responsibility for the crime? Why did he go the additional step and not just deny responsibility, but say, I'm a patsy, I'm being set up, as he does in this video clip here?
Come on, man. No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
Is that fair thinking from your perspective, Steve?
Oh, absolutely. Historians, that's what we do. We have theories and we try to prove them, and we're constantly challenging our points of view. So I think this is all very healthy. I teach a class every once in a while at the University of Oklahoma on the Kennedy assassination. My students, even students today, this generation, like your students, are fascinated by the Kennedy assassination. I have to say, you know, when I get into the assassination itself, there are so many questions that just, you know, how, here's a guy who defected to the Soviet Union, comes back to the United States, travels to Mexico City weeks before the assassination and visits the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy, and is talking about assassinating the president of the United States. A few weeks later, he does. I mean, it leaves you with lots of questions. And I think, and I'll defer to Gerald on this, where I come down on this is that I do believe that the forensic evidence, the overwhelming evidence, despite all these questions, proved that, as Gerald said, the shots came from the 6th floor of the school depository building. But what I've always, to this day, I am not certain of is what were his motivations. So the Warren Commission says that Oswald was simply this sociopath who was, you know, was in search for attention. But I don't really find that very convincing. And I think that if there's anything that has come out that I've seen in the more recent documents is that he was much more of an ideologue, and perhaps he felt that that he would be rewarded. I guess the thing that and Gerald, I'd love to get your opinion on this, is that, you know, what happened in Mexico City? And did anyone give Oswald the impression that he would be rewarded if he assassinated the president? And I think because what happened, the problem with the Warren Commission, the big problem with the Warren Commission is that not everybody told the truth to the Warren Commission. And this includes the president's own brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Now, the Kennedy administration had been launching Operation Mongoose, which was their covert activities to try to undermine, destabilize the Cuban regime. RFK didn't want the Warren Commission to know about that, so RFK did not reveal any of that information to the Warren Commission. The FBI, the CIA all kept information from the Warren Commission that would have allowed them to pursue that angle. And now, you know, I worry that those leads have all sort of expired. And so for me, that's the big question for me is not whether Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. The question is why.
Yeah, I think, you know, Steve's absolutely right. The question of motive's always been the tough one. We don't know. We'll never know 100% because Ruby took that away from us by killing Oswald. And the Warren Commission didn't get into it. The Warren Commission, although they may have come to the right conclusion, set the groundwork for the conspiracy theories because first of all, they had an official panel. We don't really trust them too much, including a former CIA director who was on them. They used the CIA and the FBI for their investigative methods, especially the FBI. Both of those agencies, as Steve said a moment ago, had reasons to lie to the Warren Commission. We found out later that Oswald had dropped off a note at the FBI headquarters in Dallas that had been destroyed by an agent. They extended their relationship with Oswald, who they had under investigation, because J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was afraid that somebody would point at his vaunted agency and say, oh, by the way, you knew this guy was a defector from Russia and you were following him and you didn't keep him on watch when the president of the United States was going on a motorcade right in front of the building that he was in that had been in the newspaper. The CIA was covering its own ass by hiding all its information together with the mafia to try to kill Castro. So the very people that the Warren Commission had to rely on had reasons not only to lie to cover their own reputations, but reasons if they were involved in the assassination to lie. And when the questions were started to be asked by the first critics in the mid-1960s, Harold Weisberg, Mark Lane, and others, there was nobody to answer them. So as a result, it built on itself. And when Cyril Wecht, who was a medical examiner in Pittsburgh, used to say the autopsy was terrible, other medical examiners would say, oh, come on, Cyril, you don't know what you're talking about. That was the autopsy of the President of the United States. They must have had the best medical examiners in the world do it. Guess what? It was terrible. When we found out the details about that, when that came out, that cast more doubts on it. When the Zapruder film was first seen in 1975, when Geraldo Rivera had it on TV, people watched it as I did, and it looks like everything you've seen in film. Somebody gets shot, they move to the background because the shooter's in front of them. You think the shooter's in the front by the grassy knoll. No wonder we've had questions about this. And then the government seals the files for all these years. So all I want your students to hear, in addition to all the reasons why they should be skeptical, is also to understand that the Oswald that I came to understand in the years that I worked on this book is somebody that nobody could have worked for in a plot, that nobody would have trusted in a plot. And remember, he did try to kill someone else before Kennedy. A few months before, he tried to kill an army general who was a right-winger tied in with John Birch Society. Oswald's politics was a bit of leftism with a bit of anarchy, a bit of new revolution in Castro. And after the assassination, he doesn't just walk away. He kills a Dallas policeman in front of half a dozen witnesses with guns fired from his own pistol. So he's somebody on the run, involved in a plot. Even if you want to think that Oswald only brought the gun to the depository that day, he has all of the flight of guilt, as Steve shows in his book, in those 24 hours after. He's not a patsy. He's involved either on his own or with a group, I believe on his own.
Let me ask you all a question that's, again, maybe more in the philosophical, because both of you are historians, scholars, and writers in your own right. And I think both of you agree that there are still a lot of questions and lingering doubts and things about this particular case that don't make it as clean and open and shut as maybe other evidence or other cases where we know prima facie evidence, or like in the case of the assassination of RFK, where Sirhan was in the room at the time. Is it not fair to suggest that rather than reach to a definitive conclusion around the Kennedy assassination, there are some historical events like this one that may be best left with unanswered questions without a neat bow, because there is really no way of knowing?
Steve, I mean, I'll be, before I let Steve wrap this up in a neat way as a historian with his understanding, I'll say that, no, I think that's an error, Fernand, for this. I hear people all the time saying, we'll never know what really happens. You know what, it's like Pearl Harbor. Did Roosevelt know beforehand and allow the attack to take place? Guess what? There's an answer to that. We can look at the credible evidence and reach an answer. The Holocaust, it happened. 6 million Jews got killed and 5 million others. Can we draw conclusions about that? Yes. The point is, if you're looking for 100% certainty, no. Are there still issues to look into, like Mexico City, Oswald's visit, and what the CIA might have known? Absolutely. Was Oswald encouraged by the Cubans or somebody in the CIA to go ahead and kill Kennedy, as Steve asked? Let's find out. But you can come to conclusions about who killed Kennedy, and you can say whether it's a plot or not. I believe today, whether that changes with new information is different, but I don't believe that we can't, in a sense, I don't mean wrap it up with a bow, but draw firm conclusions on it.
Well, let me give you an example before Steve weighs in. During the Salvadorian conflict of the 1980s, there was a massacre in El Mozote where a lot of questions about whether it was the military junta that had sponsored this massacre and knew and had foreknowledge took place, or if it was some conspiracy theory cocked up by the United States government. And now, 40 years after the fact, it just so happens in late January of this year, 2020, the individual involved for the military, for the Salvadoran government, admitted under oath that, yes, this happened. And it kind of settled a case that was an open one for 40 years. Because we haven't had on any side that kind of definitive knowledge. That's kind of what I was alluding to, Steve.
But I think there is definitive knowledge. And I agree with Gerald. There will always be questions about the assassination. But I think you have to clear out some of the clutter. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. Some are better grounded than others. And I think a lot of the stuff that's out there is really born out of like I said, this sense of nostalgia, this idea to imbue Kennedy's death with some larger meaning. The Warren Commission, as Gerald said, was flawed in many ways. There have been numerous thoughtful investigations of the Kennedy assassination since then. I mean, I think Gerald's is the classic book on the assassination. And I just find that the key questions, in my mind anyhow, the key questions are answered. The key question is that Leo Harvey Oswald was in the 6th floor of the school book depository. That Leo Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots. There was no magic bullet. That if you look at the angles that Kennedy and Connolly were seated in the car, most likely the first bullet missed. The second bullet did the damage that the Warren Commission said it did. I think Gerald, and you can correct me, Gerald, I think you changed the timeline a little bit for that, for the first shot to the third shot. And then the third shot did all the damage to Kennedy's head. And I think that, again, there's a Bruder film, you can look at it and you see Kennedy's head thrust backward. There's been a lot of evidence that shows that would not be an uncommon reaction to someone had a high-powered bullet fired into their brain. So I just think that there are certain basic facts that I don't think anyone has credibly challenged over the past 60 years. There is a lot of debate on the periphery of these things. I think I haven't spent less time looking at Ruby, but what Ruby's motives may have been. For me, I do have a lot of questions about Oswald's motives, but I do believe that the basic facts have largely been established.
And one of the things I think is important, especially for the students listening to this, I mean, Oswald, when he tried his first assassination against Edwin Walker, the right-wing general, he was 23 years old, not much older than many of you are in class. We think of him as an older figure for some reason. He had just turned 24 by a month when he shot at Kennedy. So he's at a stage when he really feels imbued with this passion that he can make a change. And as a matter of fact, no matter what you think of Oswald, if Steve's right and I'm right that he killed Kennedy, he did make a change. We're talking about him all these years later. He changed the course of American history for good or for bad. And one of the things I think is so remarkable here is that when you get down to the sort of the issue of Oswald or a plot, let's assume for a second that there was a plot. Let's say the CIA was involved. They pulled off an amazing plot because all these years later, there are some of us who are serious investigators who still think it's Oswald. They were able to do it, and we can't find the absolute evidence of conspiracy. So they planned this out to kill the president, make it look as though it was this 24-year-old loser in life, this former Marine defector, fine. And they shot him from behind so it would look like it was really Oswald. Now, in all the planning they've done, nobody ever decided how they would take care of Oswald. So instead of having a hero cop who was really a dirty cop who would run into him after the assassination, as a policeman did as he was coming down the staircase and shooting him, he would have been a hero, that cop, for shooting the supposed assassin just a minute and a half after the assassination. Instead, Oswald walks out the front door of the depository, and the conspirators must have forgotten to put somebody on the front door to stop him. He gets in a taxi for the first time in his life because he didn't have much money. That's too slow, so he gets out and takes the bus. They must have forgot to put somebody on the bus to stop Oswald. Goes back to his rooming house. They didn't put anyone there. He gets his pistol, kills a cop, gets picked up in police custody, and then they put Jack Ruby on the slow bus to kill him routine. Jack, by the way, we've got a guy involved in a plot to kill the president. Could unravel the entire thing. If you get around to it, can you kill him? Sure. So Ruby goes over and delivers pizza to the press on Friday night when Oswald's in prison, on Saturday, and finally on Sunday barely makes it down there before Oswald's transferred to shoot him. It's sort of what I call a hire for assassinate leisure time. There's a certain point at which you have to ask the logical questions of, okay, it's a big conspiracy. It worked. Oliver Stone's a historian, but how come they didn't take care of the guy they're setting up as the supposed hitman?
Let me do a round robin with both of you around a single question. That is, your positions are clear in terms of that you believe the conclusions of the government and the Warren Commission. Is there one aspect, however, of the case that even now, as we have this conversation and as the students are engaged in listening, is there one aspect of the case that leaves perhaps gnawing doubts or lingering questions in your mind that could very well unravel the whole belief that, yes, it was Oswald acting alone? Steve, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Gerald.
No. I don't think I have no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated Kennedy. As I mentioned, for me, the question is, what was his motivation? Why did he do it? And I think that's a question that the Warren Commission never adequately answered. I don't think that it's been adequately answered since, and I think we will never know the answer to that question.
Gerald.
There isn't anything that I look at in which I say, Fernand, I worry about that particular piece of evidence or what's happening there. If I thought that there was something there that might unravel the entire case, I'd be looking into that. So if you say to me, what is it that I still think has to come out? Because I'm always calling on the government to release the information. It's Mexico City. It's that area about the time when Oswald visited Mexico City and went to the Cuban mission twice, into the Soviet embassy, in which we don't have all the Cuban files yet from the Castro government, the Castro brothers, that I'd like to see more. Because if I was going to change one thing in Case Closed, if I was doing an edition today, I'd be harder on the CIA. I was hard on them already in the book because I say there was a cover-up after the assassination. People picked up evidence of that. They thought it was a cover-up of a murder. No, it was a cover-up of the truth from the agency and the FBI. And the CIA in particular, the more I look into the people in Mexico City, they went out of their way to make sure that their agency was protected ahead of the truth, ahead of serving the Warren Commission, ahead of serving history in the American public, I would be much harder on them, although I don't know where eventually we'll find that leads to.
You know, Gerald, I know neither you nor Steve are psychologists, but one of the things that is an unimpeachable truth is that President Trump had planned on releasing the last of the assassination files in October of 2017 as mandated by the JFK Records Act of 1992. And when the moment of truth came, while some files were indeed released, some were held back at the urging of the CIA, in spite of the fact that none of the members of the CIA in leadership or in any capacity were alive or in a position of responsibility at the time of the assassination. Does that not speak to perhaps bad faith if it was this neat case, as you and Steve described, of Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone without any responsibility by any aspect of the federal government?
I'm just going to jump in quickly to say, to me, it just speaks to the stupidity sometimes, and that's a word Steve may not use to relate to this, of the government. Time and time again, it gives the feeling to people that something's wrong by holding on to these files. I've called for years. I signed a letter with Jeff Morley years ago to release the files relating to the people that he was looking into. I think the government does a tremendous disservice. When Trump issued that order, I was hopeful, as was Roger Stone, who I debated at that time, that his friend Donald Trump would make those files public in their entirety. They would be able to block out and redact the names of people who might still be alive in Cuba who helped the CIA years ago so they wouldn't be hurt. That didn't happen. I was very disappointed. I still hope that those files will be released in their entirety. It's only a matter of time until we see them. They should have been out years ago.
I would just second that. I think it's a well-known government philosophy called "cover your butt," and I think that the CIA, I think the information that's probably still being held up is very embarrassing to the CIA, very embarrassing to the FBI. It would probably show how badly they dealt with the assassination, how they perhaps covered up some information. But I can't imagine there being a document, a magic bullet, no pun intended, that would undo what I see as the overwhelming forensic evidence that all the bullets that day in Dealey Plaza were fired from the 6th floor of the school depository building. One story I want to tell you. So as Gerald knows, I used to do a lot of shows for History Channel. We did one, I forget what the anniversary was of the assassination, but we went to Dealey Plaza. And the most dangerous place in America is being in Dealey Plaza on the assassination of the anniversary of the assassination with a camera crew. So I was standing there and we couldn't film anything because everyone's coming up and they're all telling me their theories about where the bullets came from. So I said, listen, I need to do this show. So I'll give you like 5 minutes. And here's what I want to do. I want to count down to 0. When I do, I want each of you, there's probably about 12 or 13 people gathered around now at this point. I want you to point to where the bullets were fired from. And I'm telling you, you would think Kennedy were gunned down by a machine gun. I mean, they were pointing up toward, obviously, the grassy knoll, the school depository building. There was a sewer someone was pointing at. It just, you know, there are just so, the bottom line is if you accept that all the bullets came from the 6th floor of the school depository building, and you place Oswald in that 6th floor of the depository building at the time of the assassination, I don't think there's been any credible forensic evidence that would suggest that bullets could have been fired from any other direction and done the damage that they did. So as long as you accept that basic forensic evidence, that all this other stuff is just noise in my mind.
Well, let's think about that from this mindset of the conspiratorial that you alluded to, Stephen, at the outset. And let's take it at face value, your perspective. This case is one where the government got it right. As unfortunate and as tragic as it really was just one lone shooter acting alone committed this apocalyptic crime that changed American and world history. When you look at the period, though, the period of 1963 through 1968, 4 very charismatic leaders of influence, either in and outside of the United States government, all had interesting demises in the same protocol, where brings to mind the Ian Fleming quote of, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, three times is enemy action. So for people that say, how do you then explain the murder of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy in a window, and that period was never repeated again? We never see in American history again lone assassins off the most influential leaders in American history. Does that not lend some credence to the idea that maybe there was a sinister hand working behind the scenes?
So wait, if I could just say, Armand, I think that adds to the feeling that people have that there was a sinister hand behind it. And one of the reasons we don't see it as much in the future, although Reagan was shot, is because security started to increase at levels far beyond that once those assassinations took place. But in addition, remember, it wasn't just them. George Wallace, the right-wing governor, the segregationist governor, was shot shortly after that. At the same time was George Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the Nazi Party. There were right-wingers and fascists also being shot down, not just the good guys, as I used to say, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. So it was this period of violence on both sides of the aisle, if you look at the far right and the center of American politics. In addition, people think that if you reach a conclusion that says Oswald alone killed Kennedy, it means you think there was no conspiracy against Jack Kennedy. I don't think that at all. I think that there were very likely a number of conspiracies against the president to kill him. If today Trump was killed or Obama had been killed beforehand, we would know, let's say we captured the assassin. The question then becomes, who's that assassin doing it for? Anti-abortionists, Islamic fundamentalists, gun advocates, who? You need to find out. Now, in the Kennedy period, did the mob hate him? Absolutely. Could a group of mafia chiefs sat around a table and said, I'm going to get that no-good SOB because his brother's attorney general and he's going after us? Absolutely. Could somebody disgruntled in the CIA think he's going to pull us out of Vietnam and I don't think he's doing any good by the agency and we should get a group of people to kill him? I wouldn't be surprised if you showed me those tapes. I'm sure there were conspiracies brewing. What I've always said about Oswald is he beat them to Kennedy, not intentionally. For his own work motivations, they would have pinned a medal on him, but he wasn't their boy. We assumed that because some people wanted Kennedy dead and somebody did it, they must be one and the same, but that's not true.
Yeah, I completely agree with Gerald. I think one point that Gerald made, which I would emphasize again, is that the whole sense of security around presidential candidates obviously changed around presidents and presidential candidates. The assassination of Ronald, I know successful is the wrong word, an assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan. But you also have to remember the decade itself. It's an enormously violent decade, the 1960s. The murder rate is going through the roof. There are lots of people who are being assassinated. If you look at these as from a macro point of view, it would seem that you could draw a line between them, but each one had their own dynamic. The assassination of Malcolm X was completely different from the assassination of JFK or RFK. And Gerald, you wrote another great classic book on Killing the Dream, which is about the assassination of Martin Luther King. You don't see any parallels between the assassination of King and the assassination of Kennedy, do you?
No, I don't, except Steve, not for the assassinations themselves or the facts or history, but in terms of what Fernand was talking about, the loss of public trust in the government, yes. The idea that there must be something connected to it. There's a straight line, two Kennedys, a preacher who made more difference in the American Civil Rights Movement than anybody in American history, Martin Luther King, that those icons had been lost. There must have been some nefarious end behind it. And then, of course, people start to say, well, Bobby Kennedy must have been cut down because he was about to disclose the truth if he became president on his brother's assassination. Martin Luther King was shaking up the government by the People's March in the summer into Washington. They must have had to stop him. So I think it fits a narrative that feeds the original mother of all conspiracies, the JFK assassination, and people view them in a similar light without looking at the facts.
Yeah,
I'll tell you one story.
Please.
Story. So, as you know, I was close friends with the president's son, John Jr., and he would never talk about the assassination. He couldn't understand why people were so fascinated by his father's death. One time he said to me, and I forget, I think it was around the time the Oliver Stone movie came out, he just said, Bobby knew everything. And I'm thinking, and as his friend, I knew it was a painful subject for him. I didn't follow up on it. But, when you think about these little doubts you have in the back of your head, well, what is it that Bobby knew that the rest of us don't know? But that was a cryptic comment, and I never followed up on it. I don't know what he meant by it.
Well, it's such a perfect segue. I was going to ask you next, Stephen, because, again, and for Gerald, too, but we're almost 60 years after the crime. So looking backwards in history, if it was a perfect conspiracy pulled off by the CIA or the mob or whomever, insert your villain of choice here, or if it was Oswald's crime, does it matter to history whether it was a conspiracy or not? Is it important for us to know whether it was or it wasn't, given the fact that we know the outcome of what the assassination was?
Well, we should always know the truth. If there was some plot to assassinate President Kennedy, then I think the public would have a right to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it would be very important to know if that existed, although it's not going to change the outcome of where we are today. Fernand, just imagine this. Forget my conclusion of my book and the fact that I would have to say, okay, completely wrong. But how about the American press? What about the New York Times, the LA Times, the press over the years that have more or less, they've looked at parts of the investigation, but they've never really truly challenged, I believe, the Warren Commission conclusion, because in the end, I think that is right. They've done their investigations. But if there was a conspiracy sitting out there that some third person's able to find, suddenly come back with the credible evidence, the American, what I call press, would have to also hang its head in shame for not having been on top of this at a much earlier time. So I think, yes, it would be momentous if that was the case.
Gerald, let me follow up on that, because, you know, short of the discovery of the film by the babushka lady who was standing in Dealey Plaza, her film allegedly taken moments after the assassination by an FBI agent that would show a shot being fired from the grassy knoll, proving forever that a conspiracy happened. What sort of evidence could come out today that would be believed? Because you even have former CIA agents like Howard Hunt, who had a deathbed confession that was kind of ridiculed and mocked. Is there any sort of evidence that you think would satisfy folks like yourself and others who say, okay, well, maybe there was a conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, Howard Hunt, I do love Howard Hunt. He couldn't even tell the truth on his deathbed, but that's another question. So as a sideline, no, that's a great question, because I've thought about this sometimes. Let's say tomorrow we find the babushka woman's film, the lady's film, and it shows nothing, the grassy knoll. Everybody's going to say it proves nothing. It's been doctored with. They must have photoshopped out the real assassin. If it shows somebody shooting from there, everyone's going to say, how do we know that hasn't been tampered with? If we had a film on the 6th floor, a surveillance film of the assassination, and let's say I found it tomorrow and showed Oswald shooting, people would say, well, how do we know he wasn't just asked a few days beforehand to be at the window with a gun? How do we know he was firing anything? So say it had audio. Now you hear the 3 shots fired. Somebody would say, well, how do I know that wasn't a trial run a week before with blanks? How do I know it was the real? So say the video surveillance showed the motorcade going down the street and it was a precision of Oswald shooting. Somebody would say, how do I know those weren't blanks and the real assassin was next door in another window who was a world-class assassin? I don't think you can come up with the evidence that would convince everybody that it's otherwise. Those of us who have looked at it reach our conclusions based on what we think is credible. But Armand, the key is, I argue where the president was hit based upon the autopsy, x-rays, and photos. There are some conspiracy theorists who think those were faked. They don't prove it to my viewpoint, but if you can't agree on the evidence, you can't agree on the conclusions.
Can I just add one point to that? I think they're all great comments from Gerald. You know, a lot of the assassination, as I said before, has to do with imposing some meaning on Kennedy's assassination. And the various conspiracy theories that have emerged since tell us more about our response really to Vietnam and to Watergate and this growing distrust of government. So, you know, a lot of the original theories about the assassination were involved, you know, the Soviets or the Cubans. And more, it's the government itself that is at the heart of these conspiracy theories. And I think that's just an indication of our growing distrust of government. And this is the mother lode. This is, you know, the government is so corrupt that it assassinated this great inspirational leader. Why did it do it? It did it because the military-industrial complex turned against Kennedy because they thought he was pulling troops out of Vietnam. I mean, most of the, not all, but most of the major conspiracy theories now, that's the focus of that's their explanation for why the government would turn against Kennedy. And it's really a simplistic reading of Kennedy, of his policies, and also of his position in Vietnam. So again, I think that we're seeing this through the filter of the events that took place after Kennedy's death, and looking back and seeing the Kennedy assassination as being the beginning of this time of troubles. And we see the government as being the evil force behind it. And I just I just think as a cultural explanation, I find that more convincing than any of the conspiracy theories.
If I could just add one thing on top of what Steve said, the government's given us reason to lose faith in the government and to believe in these conspiracies. I mean, after Kennedy was killed, they lied to us about the war in Vietnam. We had the Pentagon Papers, which showed the extent to which they lied. We had Iran-Contra, which shows the government can at times conspire against the best interests of the people. We've seen time and time again when they got it wrong on weapons of mass destruction inside Iraq and then covered it up for a while and we went to war. So we have lost faith in government. They've given us reason to. There's no doubt that at times people inside the government can conspire against the best interests of the people, but that doesn't mean it happened here in the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, Stephen, piggybacking off Gerald's point, historians with their cold pens, as John F. Kennedy referred it to as once, are they guilty of a rush to judgment and diminishing the type of thinking that says, wait a minute, this is not the truth. There was a conspiracy here, maybe not in the Kennedy assassination, but in general interpretation of historical events. Do historians sometimes buy a little bit too often into the official version of events around a series of dubious, murky things that happen, whether they be in world history or American history?
Well, it depends what historians you're talking about. But overall, I mean, I can speak to, the conspiracies I know the best, which are Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor and the Kennedy assassination. And I just think that the historians have followed the evidence. Historians, Gerald's a private investigator. I mean, Gerald gets in and digs into and does his own, focused on the Kennedy assassination and knows the details. Historians, we tend to sit back and I don't know of any historian who has spent a significant part of their career focusing, at least an academic historian, focusing on the assassination. So we tend to rely on this the credible, what we consider to be credible sources that have looked at the assassination. And that's Gerald, but it also is all these other very credible news organizations that have done their own investigation. So we tend to write history because we're not doing our own in-depth investigation. We tend to rely upon the secondary sources, ones that we deem to be credible. And I think that's the proper role for an historian. So I don't think that we, at least for me, I have never found, and I've read a lot, and I haven't read them recently, but I used to read, I remember, what was the book, Gerald, about how they switched the coffin on the plane?
Best Evidence by David Lifton.
Best Evidence. I was enthralled by that book.
It's a great book.
I was going around telling people, like, oh my God, can you believe all this happened? But then, and then as I thought about it and read more about it, I was like, really, do you think Mrs. Kennedy was going to allow them to switch her husband's body in the back of a plane with all the Kennedy people around them? It just, in my own effort to understand the Kennedy assassination. I just, when I was in college, I was walking across campus one night, and this is 1978, and I saw a sign up. And it was about a group that was talking about the Kennedy assassination on campus. And I figured, let me go. I didn't know anything about it. I haven't really thought about it much. And it was a bunch of young kids, most of them right out of college. And I'm telling you, the stuff I learned, there was like the Umbrella Man and, and all these shooters from the Dealey Plaza and, from the Grassy Knoll. And I started reading all these books. I read Mark Lane. I read Best Evidence. But as I spent more time thinking about it, I realized that they fall apart. When you expose them to the light of day, most of these conspiracy theories fall apart. And that's where I am today by default.
Gerald, I was going to say, Gerald, could something like the assassination and all of the particulars occur in today's world with social media, with instant Reddit and subforums? I mean, would there be these kinds of questions if something like that, do you think, happened today?
Boy, I think not only would there be those questions, Armand, I think they'd start faster, they'd circulate faster. Think of this, after the Kennedy assassination, it's really a couple of people, Buchanan's the first one. He's sort of an American communist living in Europe who writes a pamphlet really about the case and says, I think maybe there was some CIA or government involvement. And you have Harold Weisberg in a series of books, but there were books or pamphlets that came out. People talked about them at different gatherings and events, but they weren't on the internet the next day automatically spreading it. And in here with social media, look, we already have competing theories about where the COVID-19 started. So you look at it, and I think you'd have a much wider group of speculation from the get-go. The key being this: when you have an assassin who comes up with a pistol or a knife at the scene and is tackled, there's still a question as to whether there was a conspiracy. But you know who at least one of the perpetrators was without any doubt, because they have the gun in their hand, like, or the shooting of John Lennon by Chapman or Reagan. With a rifle from a long distance, as you have with Kennedy or with Martin Luther King, where the assassin gets away in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, you now have all of the images of Day of the Jackal, a hired assassin. The idea it was a professional hit. So you have a rifle found at the scene, you have a person killed long distance, which we all think means a sniper, a great shot, and you have the person getting away, so we don't know who they are. You would be off and running today on social media with speculation. You'd never settle the case.
Gerald, if you had the opportunity to take the most battle-hardened, cynical conspiracy theorists when it came to the JFK assassination and could just speak to them for 5 minutes about what for you is the best evidence, if you will, that speaks to why it was a case closed, what would you share with them?
Oh, no question. And this will be very unsatisfying to, I think, any hardcore conspiracy theorists and maybe to many students listening to this, but the overwhelming evidence of why this conclusion is Lee Harvey Oswald himself. Nothing else. No single fact, nothing about the magic bullet, nothing about the forensics, nothing about the shots. That's all evidence. But once you get to understand Oswald, which I did in the years that I studied him, as well as I believe you can from everything from the record, then you get to understand why this assassination happened, even if you don't know his full motivation, but you understand also why he did it alone. So the answer, Oswald. That's what they have to look at.
Stephen, going forward, do you suspect that this mistrust in government that may even be at an all-time high now, incredibly, than it was even at the lowest points of the 1960s, do you see this getting better with the passage of time, or do you see this deteriorating further and further, and the conspiratorial mindset becomes the currency of the realm, the way all Americans look at all events?
Well, as an historian, I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than the future. And I'm not very good at it. Just ask President Mondale. But I see, this trend started in the 1970s. This distrust, not just of government, but of institutions in general. And it's only grown worse over the years. I think especially given our current state of affairs. And I just see it. I don't see it. I see, unless there's some dramatic event that takes place, which I can't quite imagine what it would be, I just see it getting worse.
You mean, Steve, some dramatic event like a worldwide pandemic in which the government and the pharmaceutical
that would never happen.
Get together to save us, right? And then we all trust them again? I doubt it.
Right.
All right.
Steve, I also want to follow up in that regard, thinking about your book, The Kennedy Assassination, 24 hours after the pivotal role that President Johnson played. It's not a conspiracy theory to suggest that President Johnson himself believed that the conclusions of the Warren Commission that he appointed were not really satisfactory to explain what happened that day in Dallas. Does a revelation like that have any impact on your thinking or others' thinking?
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
Well, that would seem to indicate that you don't have full confidence in the Warren Commission report.
No, I think the Warren Commission study, and I think, first of all, is composed of the ablest, most judicious, bipartisan men in this country. Second, I think they had only one objective, and that was the truth. Third, I think they were competent and did the best they could. But I don't think that they or me or anyone else is always absolutely sure of every thing that might have motivated Oswald or others that could have been involved.
No, it doesn't. You know, first of all, you know, Johnson himself has been the subject of conspiracy theories, and there's a whole group of conspiracy theories out there that says that Johnson was somehow involved in the assassination. But Johnson, you know, it doesn't. For me, it's not a question of who believe that. Even people who I consider to be very credible, who don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. For me, it's just the evidence that I've been exposed to, and I can only make my judgment based on the evidence that I have seen and the material that I have read. I'm bringing my own judgment, my own common sense to it. And yeah, it's troubling that Lyndon Johnson never believed the Warren Commission, never believed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. That's one story I found, you know, when I was doing research for that book, and Gerald will appreciate this. I was at the Kennedy Library, and I had submitted some FOIA requests, and the head of the research came up to me and put a folder down on my desk and said, "This is your lucky day. This was declassified this morning." And it was an oral history from General McHugh. So General McHugh was the
Godfrey McHugh, yeah.
Godfrey McHugh, right. And in the oral history, which I was the first one to see, he said that after the assassination, when they all went back to the plane, he was searching for Lyndon Johnson. He couldn't find him. So they said he was in the bedroom. He went into the bedroom. He couldn't find him there. So he opened the bathroom door, and he found Lyndon Johnson sitting on the floor with his head in his hand, saying, "It's a conspiracy. They're going to kill us all. They're going to kill us all." Now, for me, what that meant to me, Johnson was an emotional guy. This was a traumatic event. He was known to being very emotional. And to me, it was just, you know, he went to where he should have gone into his bathroom and had this difficult moment. Then he came out and he was masterful in the way he dealt with the assassination. For people who believe in conspiracy, you take that very same scene and it's Johnson was either involved in the assassination or he knew there was something larger that was taking place. So, you know, everyone has to make their own judgment based on the evidence they see. And my judgment is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone.
And Armand, if I can just add one thing to what Steve said, you know, so means, motive, and opportunity. If you termed as a motive in every presidential assassination, who would be the number one suspect? The vice president. Who has the most to gain from a president being assassinated? The vice president. They're moving in to become the presidency. Now, there may be others as well, but that's automatic that Johnson would be somebody that people might consider down the road. But I think that LBJ, very important to say, did not believe it was Oswald alone. But what did he believe eventually? It was Oswald doing the shooting, but they had gotten to him first. They meaning the Cubans. First, he thought maybe the Soviets, but the Cubans knew that we were trying to kill Castro, and he's convinced they hit Kennedy first. And Oswald was their tool. It was buried there somewhere, as Jeff Morty would say, in the embassy in Cuba and Mexico City visit. But that was his fear, that it was behind there. Was he wrong? He was wrong on Vietnam and on picking Westmoreland and lots of other things, but that's a different issue. Yes.
Well, you know, Gerald, that was President Johnson's opinion as someone who was a passive participant in the assassination story, who came to that belief at the end of his life that there was a conspiracy. Someone who was an active participant is Jack Ruby, who you write also was acting alone. But Jack Ruby had something very interesting to say at the end of his life, and it was this.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. In other words, I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth pertaining to everything relating to my circumstances.
So Gerald, does even Jack Ruby's seeming confession that there was more to the story than his lone act, does that have any sway with someone like you?
No, it doesn't. And I hope that if anybody can read just a page or two from Case Closed, they might read the parts before and after it, so his supposed confession. What it really is a rant near the end of his time in prison where he says essentially, I think they're killing Jews, because he was Jewish and he thought there was actually a part of anti-Semitism behind the entire setting up of the, they're killing Jews in the walls behind this prison cell. There's part of a plot where they're actually killing people. I can hear them screaming. Jack Ruby was really far down the road of what I would call that sort of quasi-connection with reality when he gave this urgent plea that's been picked up as a reason why didn't they look at him more seriously. After he was interviewed, they didn't even take him back to Washington because they realized that what he had to say at that point was a wonderful bit of unusual fantasy, but nothing that was going to be credible or helpful as to what had happened.
And Gerald, you'll know this much better than I, but the whole timing of Ruby's assassination of Oswald, it doesn't comport with any kind of conspiracy theory. But he went to Western Union that morning. Oswald was supposed to have left and transferred before that. But if Oswald had not stopped to put on a sweater, he would have already left the jail. Ruby goes to the Western Union. He sees some commotion down by the jail, and he walks in and he pulls out his gun and he shoots Oswald. The idea that this was planned in any way just doesn't make sense.
One thing since writing the book in 1993, and that is there is always an answer from somebody who believes in a conspiracy to the point, and here's the answer I've been given on that very thing. I go through the whole process of how it's absolutely serendipity and happenstance that Ruby arrives there. At that moment, when Oswald's been delayed by a postal inspector arrived to interview him that morning, and then his own change of clothes, 30 seconds more, Ruby misses him. Somebody said to me, without any evidence to support it, but the police were only going to move him when Jack arrived. It was part of that. So if Jack was another half hour late, don't worry, they would have found another reason for Oswald to have been delayed. He would have had to go to the bathroom, or some sergeant who was taking him out would have had to take a call from his wife. They weren't going to move him until it was operating. And now that's a fantastic theory. It means you can't really say ultimately no, but you got to give me evidence before I buy it.
Gerald, before we close for you and Stephen, because one of the beliefs that has gained traction in years and the students were exposed to as well was that if there was someone that could pull off a crime of this magnitude, it would have to be professionals that understand how to pull off assassinations, that understand the tradecraft of the assassination process and moving those pieces. And the most likely suspect in that case, who would also have had motive, means, and opportunity, would have been, whether it be rogue officers or the leadership of the Central Intelligence Agency circa 1963. And if you think about it, Gerald, from the vantage point that a magician engages in an illusion, it makes you believe something that you see with your own eyes, but the very act of that illusion, by definition, is something that is not what transpired. Could it very well be, as Rolf Larson argues about your book, that your book and the lone gunman belief is the proof of the conspiracy, because it was the work of the experts?
I do love that, although I don't agree with it. Let me tell you why. What you said, Armand, is absolutely critical. Thank you for reminding me of this. There was a plot in the early 1960s with the CIA at the very best elements of their black bag operations and block operations in assassinations and wet squads to go ahead and kill a head of state. And they did work together with the mafia, the very same people who hated Jack Kennedy. And guess what? It wasn't against the president of the United States. It was against Fidel Castro. 11 attempts to kill him, and they didn't even wound him. At one point, get a bullet to him. They didn't anything inside the scuba suit when he went under. This world-class operation of great assassins who are really working to get Cuba back because the CIA doesn't want a communist government 90 miles off of Miami, and the mob wants its casinos back. They had real incentive to get him out. Can't even wound Castro, but somehow we're believed that this group of Keystone cops were able to turn around and on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, pull off a crime that 60 years later we still cannot solve. I don't buy it.
Yet, as Jefferson Morley would argue, even Castro himself is one that does not believe the conclusions of the Warren Commission because of the very nature of what you said. He understood.
He wouldn't believe. Castro wouldn't believe any conclusions of any official American, board. So I'm not surprised at that.
Steve, you were going to jump in. I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No, I think that I agree completely with, which is what I end up saying a lot of times. I agree with everything Gerald says. Well, always have for 20 years now.
Well, on that note, gentlemen, I do want to close by just one final question. You know, you mentioned it, Stephen, in your class at the University of Oklahoma. Gerald, as you continue to speak to audiences around the world with the passage of years, there is this thirst for more information, for trying to get to what really happened, whether it was Oswald or not. Do you ever see interest fading in this story of the conspiracy or the non-conspiracy behind the assassination of President Kennedy? Or will it eventually, with maybe the passage of another decade or two, be regarded in the same way that, the assassination of Garfield is considered today by most Americans?
Well, just for my perspective, I don't see it certainly going away with baby boomers like me or Steve or that. We'll keep fascinated by it. And I think that what makes it different from the assassination of Garfield or something else, it's our first television assassination. Not that it was broadcast live, but we have a videotape of it. We always go to the videotape, and here it is in color. It looks like a Hollywood film with the president and Mrs. Kennedy coming around in that pink Chanel suit, and the governor of Texas with a cowboy hat that looks like it's Hollywood casting. And then it plays out in front of us as though, you know, it's quasi-film, quasi-reality. Then the killing of Oswald is also on live television. So that means it lives for a long time in the future, plus the Kennedys. And Steve writes about this so well in, you know, his Kennedy Jr. They hold this magic hold on us in many ways, and I think that continues. So that's why I don't think this assassination goes away as easily as some others.
I agree with Gerald. For our generation, the baby boom generation, this is really a defining moment of our generation. For anyone who was at least 5 years of age, they remember exactly where they were that moment. But I do think that as we fade into the distance, as we are and soon will be, I think that it will have less of a hold. For another generation, it's 9/11 that has that same kind of power, that searing power. And I think that, you know, perhaps for generations to come, it's going to be this pandemic. So I do think, you know, time moves on and history creates new memories and new moments, and new debates and new conspiracies. And I do think that to some extent the Kennedy assassination will linger, and largely because of the viciousness of that Zapruder film and what the Kennedy family has meant. But for the other generations, the Kennedy hold is not as what it used to be. I asked my students don't know who John F. Kennedy Jr. was. They don't know who Robert Kennedy was. So I do think it will gradually. We are the last generation, I think, that will be devoting a lot of time debating and discussing the Kennedy assassination.
Well, thank you both for investing your time. How generous it has been, especially in the backlot of what we're all going through with this coronavirus pandemic. If you could all just throw up a little U for our students at the University of Miami.
Absolutely. You know,
thanks.
Three of us, you're the smartest one because you're the only one sheltering in place outdoors in the wonder of Miami weather. I don't know why the two of us are indoors, so those Steve's in New York.
And Steve, don't forget to pick up Gerald's new book. Gerald, I think you got one behind you. Why don't you bring it up to the camera so we can see that must-read new edition. It's called Pharma, because, folks, in all seriousness, an important book to understand what a lot of people think is a conspiracy, a modern conspiracy of how pharmaceutical companies are price fixing and price gauging. Gerald, tell us about it.
Actual conspiracies, absolutely true. As bad as you think it is with big pharma, it's worse. And to say that it's hard to imagine, but it's a history of having always somehow held back on side effects, pushing profits over cures at times. There are some great people in the lab trying to get real cures, but there are plenty of bad actors, and it's the type of story that just makes your blood boil.
One of the things I love about Gerald is when he finds a conspiracy, he writes about it. And he found it in Big Farm.
That's right.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, and stay safe, practice your social distancing, and hopefully we'll be able to do one of these in the flesh in a new normal American world again.
That's right. Thanks, Amand. Appreciate it.